Hey guys, today we're going to be learning about supply-side economics, aka Reaganomics. First, I'm going to teach you the basics of supply-side economic theory. Then I'm going to talk about how Ronald Reagan implemented this theory during his presidency, and after that we'll wrap up with the effects that Reaganomics had on the country. So first things first, what is supply-side economics? Now, there are entire college courses dedicated to studying this topic, and economic theory can get pretty complex and frankly kind of subjective, so I'm going to keep this as simple as possible. The basis of supply-side economics is that greater economic growth can be achieved by investing in what is called capital. We can loosely define capital as goods and services that have already been produced that are then used in the production of another good or service. If you think of this in the context of a stereotypical factory setup, the machinery, the physical structure that houses the factory, and even the workers themselves are considered to be capital. This is because these things have already been produced. They're not what the factory is creating. Instead, the machinery, the building, and the workers are going to be utilized to create the product that the factory is then going to sell. According to supply-side economic theory, by investing in capital, consumers will benefit from an increased supply of goods and services that are available at a cheaper cost. Question break. Supply-side economists believe that investment in what is the key to increasing production? Is it A, mutual funds, B, government bonds, C, capital goods, or D, treasury bills? The answer to this question is capital goods. This is the basic supply and demand model that economists use to illustrate economic theory. The supply side of the economy is represented here by the red line, and the demand side of the economy is represented in blue. According to supply-side economics, if market expansion is driven by an increase in demand, there will be a sharp increase in price, but only a marginal increase in output. That is because without increased investment in capital, businesses are not able to significantly increase their production. However, if economic expansion is driven by an increase in supply instead, then more goods will be available at lower prices. This allows more people to buy more things while spending less money. Investment in capital will also increase the demand for workers and therefore create more jobs. Question 2. According to supply-side economic theory, increases to demand cause what? Is it A, inflation, B, recession, C, stagflation, or D, underproduction? Now the answer here is actually A, inflation, and I'm really testing your understanding of supply-side theory here. If we go back to our original graphs, you see that as demand is pushed outward, prices go up and it does not match the increase in production. Because prices are now higher and there's marginally more than there was before, meaning there's not a lot more, the value of the dollar has effectively decreased. In economic terms, this is known as inflation. So that's supply-side economics in about 90 seconds. Now that you understand that, let's get into Reaganomics. Before we dive into Reaganomics, you need to understand the historical context. The 1970s in the United States were a time of bad hair, bad music, and a bad economy. The decade saw the occurrence of an economic phenomenon called stagflation. A sinking GDP, high inflation, and rising unemployment combined to create a dangerous amalgamation of a shrinking economy and a currency that was losing value. The presidents of the 1970s tried to curb this by raising interest rates, but it backfired and things continued to slide. Fast forward to 1981 and Ronald Reagan's elected. The economy wasn't as bad as it was in 1972, but the economy certainly wasn't prospering. One of the major planks of Reagan's platform was his plan to jumpstart the economy, called Reaganomics. It essentially boils down to four main pillars: lower taxes, reduced government spending, less regulation, and tightening of the money supply. And all that sounds like pretty good stuff, and if all that stuff was done, it certainly wouldn't be a bad thing. But how much of this was Reagan actually able to accomplish? Well, as it turns out, and maybe not particularly surprisingly to anyone who pays attention to politics, he wasn't able to accomplish all of these things. He was successful in passing federal tax cuts, however. The 1981 Tax Act reduced the top tax from 70% to 50%. In 1986, during his second term, Reagan lowered the top tax rate again, this time all the way down to 28%. Some other numbers are equally good. After increasing interest rates triggered a short recession in 1981, things began to turn around. GDP consistently rose during the Reagan presidency, unemployment trended downwards, and inflation dropped from around 13% in 1981 to only marginally above 3% by 1988. But despite all these very good sounding things, Reaganomics has gone down as really polarizing. Today, Reagan is remembered as anything from a hero to an idiot. Why is this? Well, as it turns out, there's actually quite a few criticisms that can be levied against Reaganomics. First, all of the talk about curtailing government spending and revising the federal budget deficit didn't pan out. Due mostly to the defense spending binge that Reagan went on, the national debt ballooned to over $2.7 trillion during his presidency. But what about those tax cuts? Again, that really depends on who you ask. While the income of the upper class soared in the 1980s due to an expanding stock market, incomes in the middle and lower classes actually began dropping. By 1995, the richest 1% controlled 40% of the country's wealth. One of the most overlooked effects of Reaganomics is the closing of mental hospitals. The mass closure of many of these facilities led to a lot of these patients living on the streets, and homelessness increased dramatically in major cities. And while government spending increased overall, funding for programs that help the poor like food stamps and free school lunches were slashed. This brings us to question 3. Were the benefits of Reaganomics enough to outweigh the costs? So, were the gains that the financial sector made during the 1980s and early 1990s sufficient to cover the costs of the growing income inequality and the lack of funding to social welfare programs that occurred under the Reagan administration? So, did Reaganomics usher in a golden age in the history of the United States, or was it the cause for many of the problems that plague modern America, like massive federal debt, shocking income inequality, and the sad state of this country's mental health care system? The answer to both of those questions is both yes and no. By most metrics, the U.S. economy did expand quite rapidly under the Reagan administration, and it's fair to assume that the administration's policies had at least something to do with that. But as we've seen, there were certainly some downsides to this growth as well. At the end of the day, the way people view Reaganomics and by default the Reagan presidency really depends on their own experiences, where they come from and what they value. But that's sort of a microcosm of American history right there. It's all about perspective. The supply-side economic information from this video is found at www.investopedia.com, and the Reagan historical background and presidency information was used from The Reagan Revolution, Crash Course U.S. History, number 43. You can find all of their videos at www.youtube.com/crashcourse.